Welcome back to our second session, everyone. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Victoria. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of today's summit, titled Best Practices for AWS Resource Management. Thank you for being here, and thanks to our sponsors, Clumio and Lacework, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this premium content. Our speaker for this session is Elias Knazer, a former Gartner analyst who has focused for nearly a decade on private, hybrid, and public cloud computing. Now an independent consultant and researcher, he engages with customers and vendors on all aspects of cloud, edge, and data center transformation strategies. He's also the author or co-author of 6 books, and he's written hundreds of articles for top tech publications, including our own Virtualization and Cloud Review. Elias, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity. Hi, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to present to you. Like David said, I've been covering this topic for a very long time, and I hope I can bring some value. I listened in a little bit towards the end of the last session. I think it was a fantastic session that was packed with plenty of content. There was a user that asked about tagging, if they're still on. I think there's a way to export your AWS billing. I think it's data exports, and there's a way to see the tagging. It's easy there to kind of sort through it and see which ones are not tagged. So just FYI there. So folks, when we're talking about cost optimization, one of the things that I tell customers all the time is cost optimization is not a one and done, right? It's not something that you're going to do and then you're going to just forget about it. It is a continuous thing. It's something that you sort of have to have your hands in all the time. You're continuously optimizing. Again, like the earlier speaker said, you know, at some point you go back and take a look at some of the things that maybe there's a better way to design, and one of the best practices here is how to design. We'll talk about that in a second. But the idea, the thing to keep in mind is that it is a continuous thing. It is not something that you're going to do and then just move on and forget about it. But I also want to invite you to convert IT from a cost center to a revenue center. More often than not, and it's clear from the content today, from your engagement today, that cost is top of mind for many of you, and cost has always been top of mind in IT, right? So even before cloud, when I was still, you know, working through VMware and Citrix before that, and Windows NT and Novell and all of this, cost was always something that consumed us. It was something that was top of mind for the CIO, for the managers. And to be honest with you, in my career in IT, it's always felt like IT was always justifying the costs. It's like we were always embarrassed and we always wanted to cut the budget, and we were asking for money, but we're sort of asking for money in a shy way. And we always felt it was our obligation to continuously cut costs. I invite you to flip the script. It's not like you're taking this money home. It's not like you're spending this money on a car or something personal. You're spending this money to empower the business. You're spending this money because without technology, your business is not going to be able to compete. So instead of obsessing about cost all the time, we need to explain these costs to the business. Now, there isn't a time in IT. There isn't a time in IT like today. This is one of the very few times, and hopefully this will be moving forward, where business and technology are becoming indistinguishable. This is the AI has really changed the script. It flipped the script. You know, you've got folks that sit in front of ChatGPT, and let's take a very simple example. You know, formulas in Excel where they have to call the help desk for help with formulas in Excel. Now they can ask ChatGPT for that. You've got people that are trying to develop things. Well, they'll get help from ChatGPT in order to build the code, right? So that business user has for the first time found that he or she can leverage technology without the need to call anyone. This is where business is truly becoming indistinguishable from technology. And this is an opportune time for us, because our management, because the business understands and realizes that in order to compete, to differentiate, they have to win with technology. Technology is the differentiator today. This puts us as IT in a pole position to explain the cost, but not necessarily always having to obsess over the cost. So someone asked about SageMaker in the previous session, and the presenter correctly answered that, if you're not using it, turn it off. I would challenge you to do something different. Instead of turning it off and again having to obsess over it, what is the business driver that is making you use SageMaker? It is not for you to turn it off. If you have a business justification for it, if it is serving a business purpose, keep it on and the business will pay the cost. That I invite your mindset to shift from one that is justifying and taking on the burden of the IT budget to one that is saying, hey, this is a business function. There is nothing in the business more important than technology today. And as a result, use it to your advantage. Now, all of this being said, that doesn't mean we don't do our best. We absolutely have to do our best, but within our means, right? Instead of focusing so much on cost, let's focus on everything else that would give us a competitive advantage. So let's start with number one. My first best practice for you is to use the right discount models. When I'm talking to customers, I can't tell you how often, especially with AWS, that customers aren't aware of all of the things that are at their disposal. And there are so many things. Again, whether it's AWS or Azure or Google, Oracle, or all the cloud providers, all the hyperscalers, they will throw the kitchen sink at you, right? So there's savings plans here and reserved instances and scheduled reserved instances and enterprise agreements and spot instances and probably 100 more, right? So it becomes overwhelming when you're trying to figure out, well, what do I do? What do I use where? And especially if the environment is very large, you're having to figure out the discount model for EC2 and then the discount model for SageMaker and the discount model for Amazon S3, and it becomes overwhelming. And some larger organizations have dedicated folks just for the task of cost optimization. In my opinion, I would say unfortunately, and this is where I would hope, and we're starting to see a lot of that with AWS and other cloud providers. But I would hope AI can play a large role here. So instead of having someone, again, sitting there and obsessing and trying to correlate and figure out what everything is happening within the AWS environment, I'm hoping services like Trusted Advisor and other things, Optimization Hub that we're going to talk about today, will help you get a better handle on what is going on within your environment. But that being said, there are things that we have to take into account. All of you have probably heard of reserved instances, know how to use them, know some of the benefits of reserved instances. If you're not using reserved instances, especially if you've got applications or workloads that are steady state that you're going to have for a long time. Take a domain controller would be a perfect example. It's not like you're going to shut off a domain controller anytime soon. So you'd probably want a reserved instance on a domain controller for maybe like a 3-year period, right? The domain controller, the workload, the nature of the application itself, it's probably not going to necessitate that you upgrade the memory or the CPU that often. So again, a typical workload for something like a reserved instance. But then you have something like a savings plan. And here's where a lot of the customers, at least that I talk to, kind of get confused, because when you look at reserved instances and you also look at savings plans, they're kind of similar, right? So one of the most important things to understand is, well, what are the differences? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences just to give you kind of a taste for why they are different, right? So a reserved instances in general are based on the commitment to use an instance at a particular price over a specific period of time. That period of time is typically 1 to 3 years. You're committing to this instance. You're spending this dollar amount per hour over a specific period. The savings plan is a little more flexible. Instead of committing to a reserved instance, and a reserved instance will come with a specific, family type, specific operating system. It's in a specific region, specific availability zone, sometimes yada, yada, yada. Savings plans are more flexible. Savings plans offer multiple location and region and usage types, right? So they're convertible reserved instances. Um, so a step back, right? So a savings plan offers multiple locations. You're not limited to that location or region, and you're also not committing to that instance type or family or operating system. You're essentially committing to using an amount of compute power in this case, again, over a period of time, which is typically a 1 or 3 year. So you got more flexibility. The first one, you have to worry about, maybe converting it, maybe changing the reserved instance. If you change the instance type, so on and so forth. So that becomes a little bit of a challenge. I kind of like both. I think they both have their place. And again, I think it's going to depend on the workload, the application that you're running on it. But understanding the differences and when to use each would significantly help you. Now, another thing, especially with AWS, that's not as popular, which is the enterprise discount program. And when I say not as popular, maybe it's not as well known, maybe not all customers know it. And to be honest, the enterprise discount program with AWS requires a specific dollar amount. So you have to be at a specific level before this makes sense. But the enterprise agreements in particular are very popular with Microsoft. That's actually what gives Microsoft a little bit of an edge in terms of pricing there. But the important thing is to be aware that AWS has this option for you. And you should constantly be reviewing and revising this with your account executive to see if your spend with AWS qualifies for an enterprise agreement like. And if it does, take a look at what the discounts that can be offered, because an enterprise agreement again becomes more of an umbrella, so to speak, across these discounts. So they should, in theory, be steeper discounts. So the idea here is, maybe once a year, have a review of your account and make sure you bring up the enterprise discount program and see if you qualify for it. Another thing that is usually ignored is the use of spot instances. Now, spot instances are probably one of my favorite compute instances or types on AWS. Now, the idea here is AWS has these capacities, these instances that go unused at the end of the month, and they have to put them on like a form of auction to kind of get you to consume them, to use them, right? So they don't go idle and they're not making money. Now, when they're doing that, because it's capacity that's kind of, they've oversized it, you're able to use this capacity and get access to it at a significantly reduced price. The downside is you're bidding on this, right? So let's say you bid on a bulk number of instances, and you said, I'm going to pay 10 cents an hour. And, our friend David, the editor, comes in and says, you know what, I'm willing to pay 8 cents an hour. You are immediately going to lose access to that spot instance, and David will get access to the number of instances that he requested for 8 cents an hour. Or if he outbids you, basically, he will get a better option. But spot instances are good for certain type of resources, right? So if you're using things like Hadoop clusters, if you're using things like high performance compute, if you're using things like web servers, those things tend to work well with things like spot instances. Because if you've got, let's say, 200 of them and you lose 50 because, David outbid you, and here I think I gave the wrong example in terms of the dollar amount, but in case he paid a little more than what you do, he will get access to these instances. If that happens, then you're using, let's say, 50 of those instances, but so what? You still have 150 more. It still gives you the option at some point to go back in and bid on maybe another set of instances at a later time. But the idea is you're using these as a cluster, so it doesn't really matter. So leverage spot instances for the right workload. They could be significant money savers for your environment. Now, number two is scheduled resources or scheduled reserved instances. Now, scheduled reserved instances give you a little more flexibility over just the traditional reserved instance. So the traditional reserved instance, again, you're locking yourself into an instance, an operating system, a family type over a period of 1 or 3 years. Whereas with scheduled reserved instances, it allows you to reserve instances for predefined blocks of time on a recurring basis for a 1-year term. And you'll get discounts, I think it's up to 10% lower than the equivalent on demand. So what you're saying here is, look, I don't need to have this reserved instance for the whole year, but I do know that at the end of every month, we have, I don't know, we're closing the books at the end of every single month, or maybe every single quarter, or however way it is. So you know that at the end of a particular period, you always need these instances to be available to you. And as a result, you can schedule them and pay for that block, for that tranche of time, instead of blocking it for a larger period of time. So that gives you even steeper discounts than when you're doing just a reserved instance where you're blocking the whole thing. So these are things that you want to take into account when you're looking at scheduled resources. Those, again, this is when you know that you need to increase the capacity at a particular time of the month. You buy a scheduled reserve instance for the capacity you're going to increase for a period of 3 or 4 or 5 days, for example, during the week or during the month. Now, the third one, and you've probably heard this many times, is right sizing and upgrading instances. Now, every cost optimization tool that's worth its weight is going to give you this type of functionality, whether it's AWS tools that are native to AWS or third-party tool. This is kind of have become table stakes, right? So being able to right size and upgrade the instances for something that makes more sense is kind of what you need to do. That's the basics of what you need to do. Yet again, I find a lot of customers that don't do that. Everybody's aware of it, everybody talks about it, everybody understands it, but very few customers actually do it. Some customers don't want to pay the additional cost of the third party optimization tools, so they never end up doing it, although they're aware of it. Other customers use the AWS native tools. Sometimes they use the free ones. They don't pay for better recommendations. As a result, they end up not getting the best use of it. So, although this is kind of an obvious one, this is something that you're probably aware of, you should be aware of, this is something that you should be doing. Right sizing your applications is crucial, and upgrading them whenever it makes sense is also crucial. Sometimes you'll find that a memory intensive application will give you a better price than a CPU intensive application. Although the CPU intensive instance that you're choosing is ideal for your virtual machine because your instance, because your application is CPU intensive, sometimes you'll find that the memory intensive one has the right CPU level that you're looking for. So the CPU is good enough, but that one is cheaper. So you might want to right size. Sometimes when you initially created the instance, the application owners, the developers, whatever, requested a certain resource profile, right? They needed certain amount of CPUs, certain amount of memory, certain amount of IOPS on the disk, and you gave it to them. But after 6 months or after 8 months or after a year, you could take a look at this usage and say, we've only used 50%. Well, 50% is not a lot. You can always right size this and you have immediate savings. Upgrading the instances can also yield savings. Sometimes you could stay within the same family, but there's a newer instance that gives you the same CPU, same memory, but that newer instance might be cheaper because there's power efficiency in newer CPUs, et cetera, et cetera. So always be looking at right sizing and upgrading instances whenever you can. Now, Cost Optimization Hub from AWS is something that I really like, and I think it has a lot of fantastic capabilities. So AWS optimization opportunities to a single dashboard. So we talked earlier about the different capabilities that you have, the different discount models that you have, the different recommendations that AWS might offer across different services like EC2 and SageMaker and storage and all of these things. The nice thing about Cost Optimization Hub, single pane of glass. So you go to this dashboard and should highlight the different recommendations that you have access to. It'll identify savings opportunities for you. So very similar to that AI example that I was talking about, but I'm hoping that Cost Optimization Hub becomes a little more, let's just call it intelligent for now. It incorporates your specific AWS pricing. So that's also crucial because as an organization, sometimes when you're looking at these savings plans, you know that, okay, well, I'm going to get 10% here, I'm going to get 20% there. But you don't know when you're compounding all of these, when you're aggregating all of these, what are you going to end up with, right? So that becomes the hard part, is understanding at the end of the day, after I've compounded all of these things, they sound great, they look great, but how much am I really saving? That is where a Cost Optimization Hub comes into play. It allows you to easily identify, filter, and aggregate over 15 types of AWS cost optimization recommendations. So you're looking at things like EC2 instance right sizing recommendations, Graviton migration recommendations, idle resource migrations, and savings plans recommendations. And it'll do this across your AWS accounts, across regions. So that is why I highly recommend the Optimization Hub. If you haven't used it, if you haven't leveraged it, I encourage you to do that, because again, it allows you to take a step back and look at your AWS estate in a single dashboard. And if I were a betting man, I would say that, I mean, again, when Cost Optimization Hub came to the scene, it was a little bit before this whole craze of AI and Gen AI came to the scene. So this year at reInvent, and there's nothing under NDA here, I have not been briefed on this. This is just purely speculation. I expect things like Cost Optimization Hub to be empowered with Q, which is AWS's artificial intelligence, to give you a little more handle and a little more recommendations, a better understanding of how your environment is running and how you can potentially optimize it, whether through redesign, whether through the use of changing up resources, or maybe applying different discount programs. I think that should be almost a given for something like that this year. Now, number 5 is design with cost optimization in mind. This one is crucial. And earlier in the earlier session, one of the people that are asking a question were asking a question about, should we migrate everything or should we migrate one application at a time? The crucial thing is to design with cost optimization in mind. Now, what does that mean? Now, when you're designing with cost optimization in mind, you want to not just do lift and shift. Lift and shift is the worst thing that you can do, and sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes there are certain sets of circumstances where a lift and shift is a must. But I'm talking in an ideal scenario where you have you have time, you're not pressed on migrating everything. You want to design with cost optimization in mind. You want to refactor, redesign, rethink how you're moving things. And here, when I say rethink and refactor and redesign, don't automatically assume that you have to take the entire application and recode it for the cloud. That is another mistake that a lot of customers do, which slows down the migration, doesn't yield the benefits that you need, and honestly, it'll end up maybe costing you more. But there are certain things that you can do while redesigning the application where you could save money and you're refactoring it. There's an example that I always give. It's a simple example, but it highlights the necessity to have a different mindset when you're designing for cloud. And this different mindset will yield results for you from a cost optimization perspective, but it'll also yield results from a security perspective and a whole slew of other things. Let's take a web server farm that you potentially have on premises in your data center. You might have a web server farm that consists of 20 web servers. If you take 20 web servers and you simply lift and shift them, move them to the cloud, you've probably saved nothing. And if you do end up finding savings, you're going to find very little savings. Actually, it might cost you a little more. So maybe it costs you a little more, maybe it costs you a little less, but let's say in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of equal. In that case, you've done no design. You have put no effort. You've simply taken what you've learned in the data center for the last 30 years and simply done a vMotion or a live migrate from your on-prem environment to the cloud. But instead of doing that, you could take the same web server farm that you have, create an auto-scaling group on AWS, use your automation capabilities on AWS, whether it's infrastructure as code, with CloudFormation, whether it's third party, whatever the case might be. And then maybe put 3 web servers into this auto scaling group. And then based on utilization, if you find that you can set policies that say, if my CPU utilization hits 50%, I want to automatically deploy another instance. And then if your CPU utilization or memory utilization or disk or network or whatever metric you choose fall below a certain parameter, then you're going to remove an instance, thereby always balancing the number of instances that are live within the auto scaling group that can service this application. So by doing that, you have cost optimized the environment. Why? Because again, you are reducing the number of servers just off the bat from having 20 to having on a steady state 3 or 4 or 5. So at best case scenario, let's say you're going to have 15 instances that you now don't need to turn on when it comes to what you've migrated to AWS. Now, another thing that you could do here is embrace a DevOps mentality. Now, I'm using the term platform ops here because I believe DevOps is not a thing. DevOps an idea. DevOps is a mindset. DevOps is a set of standards, principles, but it is not a thing. You can't really implement DevOps. There's no standards and principles on how you implement it, which is why folks that have tried to do DevOps have always, not found the boundaries between the developers and the ops folks and the developers and the business folks. It's always been a mess. Platform ops, on the other hand, is a lot more disciplined than DevOps. Platform ops will embrace all of the principles of DevOps, but it puts them into practice. It gives you delineation of responsibilities between your engineering team and your development team and the application team. Like there is clear delineation on who's doing what. And as a result, you can take everything that you wanted to do with DevOps and actually implement it with platform ops. And one of the things that the platform ops team should own is actually own the budget and adopt FinOps principles, FinOps capabilities. Now, FinOps has a ton of capabilities, as you can see on the screen here. And as part of building that platform ops team, every time you go to migrate an application, every time you go to operationalize an application, every time you want to do anything with an application, your platform ops team is going to be well versed in this type of a discipline where they know how to implement these things. Now, I know someone is going to jump out and say, well, shouldn't we have a dedicated FinOps team? Eli's advice, my experience, what I've seen, the answer is no. Forget about cloud. Did you ever have a dedicated FinOps team in the data center? I mean, we have been doing things in the data center for the last, 50 years? We never had a dedicated FinOps team. At least I've worked in some of the largest corporations. I don't remember having a FinOps team, a dedicated FinOps team. So, no, I wouldn't have a dedicated FinOps team in the cloud either. In the cloud, I understand that, again, we talked about it at the beginning, things can be overwhelming, but things are becoming a little easier. They're becoming more consolidated. Things like Optimization Hub will help. AI hopefully will help. The principles of FinOps are crucial, but you don't need a dedicated team. What you do need, like I said earlier, is a mindset change. Engineers and developers and application owners, everyone that touches the cloud, they have to understand that every single decision they make, whether it's technical or not, has an immediate financial implication. Every single decision they make. Now, one can argue that this was always the case, even in the data center days. You could, misconfigure a SAN and order a couple of extra trays of storage. But it wasn't as obvious back then. We always found a usage for this extra trays of storage, right? We always found usage for an extra server that was ordered extra. But when you're dealing in the cloud, every decision you make, every technical decision you make has an immediate cost implication. You're going to see it on your AWS bill at the end of the month right away. So it kind of, you're shining a spotlight on it very quickly. This is why I say if you have a platform ops team, and platform ops teams are becoming more popular. I still don't see them as much as I'd like to within organizations, but they are starting to happen, right? We still have to figure out, the platform ops team versus the SRE teams and all sorts of acronyms that are out there. But the platform ops team is the one responsible for this, and that team should embrace FinOps principles, everything that you're seeing here on the screen, and as a result, they're designing using these principles. Now, I talked a little bit about designing with cost optimization in mind, and that leads us into number 6, which is you want to use PaaS services as much as you can. And again, when we say PaaS services, don't automatically go to the very complicated ones. Sometimes there are easy, low-hanging fruits that you can use to save money very quickly. I'll give you more examples. So if you've got your load balancer on premises and you decide, you know what, we're going to go to AWS, would you go with a third-party load balancer? Like, let's say you're using X brand on-prem. Would you use that X brand as a virtual appliance on AWS, or would you use the native load balancer? My advice to you is first, do a comparison of features between what AWS offers you natively and what this third party is offering you. Because if you can find feature parity, or if you can satisfy all of your requirements using the native capabilities of AWS, then you're going to find that it is significantly going to be cheaper. It is going to be better integrated with all of the services, and you're offloading another task, the operational task, off your back, right? So if you move the same brand third party appliance onto the cloud, you're still responsible for maintaining it, for patching it, for making it highly available, etc., etc. If you use a native load balancer from AWS, you're offloading all of these costs. The trick here is, how do we quantify these costs? And this is why I always say you want to try not to obsess over costs, because costs are, if you truly want to dig into them, they're extremely hard to figure out. There are some costs that, how do we quantify, right? So if one person is responsible for patching and doing all of these things, but I'm using the native capabilities, how do I quantify some of these tasks? You can probably do it, but it's going to take a while for you to figure out. And the same thing will apply to databases. If you've got a SQL database, are you going to put an instance, a virtual machine, and put SQL in it? Or are you going to leverage, for example, on AWS, you're going to leverage RDS? These are small things, small tweaks you can make to your workloads, to your applications, that would bring you a lot of capabilities, and at the same time potentially reduce your cost as you're using them. So leverage past services, the easy low-hanging fruit, and the more complicated ones at some point as well. Storage lifecycle management is another one of those that, when I talk to customers, they all seem to know it, but when I look at some of the environments, it's spotty how people are using storage lifecycle management. It's become just easier to just put everything on S3, the default tier essentially, and kind of forget about it. But storage lifecycle management allows you, using policies, to control the different tiers that you're storing your data on. If you haven't accessed data in, let's call it 6 months or 12 months, why does it need to remain on tier 1 storage? AWS has many different tiers where you can start to say, after 6 months, move this from, S3 to Glacier. For example, I'm just throwing something out there. Different tiers will have different retrieval times, different redundancies, different availability, etc., that you would want to take into account. But they also come with steeper discounts, significantly reduced pricing for the storage. So if you haven't accessed something in 6 or 8 months, do you immediately need it, or can you wait a little bit to retrieve it? Those are things that are important. Also, take a look from a regulatory compliance perspective. Do you need to save this data indefinitely? The answer might be yes, and as a result, you have to save it. But depending on the industry that you're in, depending on the data that you're trying to collect, there might be a regulatory time where, hey, maybe after 5 years or after 7 years, you could discard of this data. So if you have data that you've been keeping that you don't really need to keep, then the question is, what is the value of keeping this? Are you going to have any kind of analytics that is running against it? Do you need it from a regulatory perspective? But if you don't, there's nothing wrong with discarding some of this data. For if it doesn't need to stay there, then it doesn't need to stay there. So those are things that I would highly recommend that you keep in mind as you're going through this environment. Now, my number 8 best practice for you here, and we're going to finish a little early, so hopefully I can take a little more of your questions. But number 8 is also a little bit of a controversial topic. Now, whenever I bring up chargeback, everybody seems to be in favor of chargeback. But everybody sort of fails to implement chargeback, because chargeback needs to be integrated typically into your ERP system. You're charging back a particular department. It becomes a little bit of a nightmare to implement chargeback. But there's no reason we couldn't take the ideas, the principles of chargeback, and do a showback. So the difference between a showback and a chargeback is, chargeback, you're actually implementing. The money is essentially moving between P&Ls, moving between departments. It needs integration with your ERP system. That might require custom development, might require training. It might be a little bit of a mess. But showback should be easier. using the data that you have in the AWS Management Console, using the data exports that I mentioned at the beginning of the session, where you can export a lot of your AWS billing stuff onto Excel spreadsheets. You can, especially if you have a good tagging policy in place, and maybe one of the tags should be the department that is using the asset. The earlier speaker mentioned policies where you could enforce tagging. And what that means is a resource is trying to be created, and that resource does not have a tag associated with it, then that resource doesn't get created. The previous speaker said that might be a little harsh. I'm telling you, that's not harsh. I wouldn't allow a resource to be created without the right tag. Why should it be? If that means that is a call to the help desk, then so be it. But what you get is you avoid resources that don't have an owner. And if you enforce this policy, people will learn to use it. They will learn to follow your instructions. They will learn to follow whatever cheat sheet you've given them on the types of tags that they need to enter before this resource becomes available. Once you have these tags in place, you should be relatively easily be able to put together reports that show who is using the different resources within your AWS estate. What that gives you is it takes us back to where I started the conversation, which is to turn IT from a cost center into a profit center, essentially. You're going to take a step back and tell the business, hey, we're not really using anything. Here's the IT related resources. Here's how much they're costing us a month. And here's the percentage of IT resources compared to the entire AWS spend. So if you're spending $100,000 on AWS resources per month, and you're able through tagging and other things to show that IT related services are coming out to whatever the case is, let's say it's 10%, that's $10,000. $90,000 is being spent by the business. So again, you're not whipping yourself anymore. You're not having to obsess over costs. You're able to show them, hey, you are consuming this. It is their job to then figure out what is this spend yielding in terms of business benefit. That is a business conversation. They have to figure out what they're spending on technology, how much is it yielding in terms of revenue. And on top of all of that, let's expand this conversation a little bit. That 10% that I talked about, that is the IT spend. That is not something that you are spending for yourself. These are shared resources, right? So whether you're putting in there your security capabilities, whether it's your DNS services, all of that, that 10% should then be taken and divided over all of the different departments that are leveraging that infrastructure, because that's shared services. That infrastructure is needed to make everything else that they're using work and function. So at the end of the day, you take a step back and you really haven't spent a penny. You go to your CFO, you go to your CEO and say, hey, as far as IT is concerned, we don't really need a budget. You guys keep all of the budget. Let us know what you need. We will enable it for you and charge you back or show you back however way financially within the environment things work. But from my perspective, it is high time for us to not focus on cost as if it was the only thing that we are required to do. And when the business is making us responsible for it, I invite you to flip the script. It is not money that you're taking home. It's not your money. You're using this money to advance the business. If they want to cut, sure, cut resources. Your job is to simply show, and it is their job to then figure out how this spend is tied back to revenue. Now, folks, if you like this type of content, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a self-advertisement here. I've got a ton of resources. I also have a YouTube channel where I try to regularly publish this type of content, one question, one answer, the things that I hear from customers. I cover that on my YouTube. I also have a cloud masterclass on Udemy and a multi-cloud masterclass on Udemy as well. I've got a ton of courses that I used to publish on Pluralsight. I invite you to check them out. With that being said, I think I'm a little bit early. I got a little too excited, so I was a little too fast in my delivery, but I would absolutely love to take some questions.
Okay, great stuff, Elias. And we do have a lot of reader questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's go to the Q&A console right now. Here's our question from Lynn in the audience. Lynn asks, how do organizations, let me start again. How do organizations identify and eliminate resource inefficiencies and waste in their AWS deployments, especially considering the dynamic nature of cloud environments?
Well, so that's a great question, and thank you for that. So inefficiencies can come in a couple of different ways. There are some inefficiencies that are going to be obvious to you, where you're going to be able to use your experience, your knowledge of your organization, your knowledge of the application. I feel like sometimes we've underestimated how much knowledge we know of these applications. Like in the past, and I'll give you an example of myself. I used to argue a lot with application owners. They would come to me, and I'm talking 30 years ago, I was a Citrix administrator. And those of you that remember Citrix back in the day, we used to argue over how we're going to put this on a server and how much resources does it need and whether there's latency or not, et cetera, et cetera. So we had intricate knowledge of the application. I still believe we have intricate knowledge of the application, but we've sort of, I don't want to say we've become lazy, but we've sort of kind of given into the idea that it's now on cloud, so I'm just not going to comment. I'm going to see if there's a tool that can help me. I would say you have the experience to know if what this application needs. So for traditional COTS application, let's start with those because those are the most popular ones. You have the knowledge. Figure out if the deployment that you're doing is the most efficient deployment. Again, I gave you examples of autoscaling groups, gave you examples of load balancers, managed services like SQL. Look at the application, see how it is designed today, and see is there a more efficient way? Can you take certain components of how you've deployed this application and make it more efficient? Can you use Lambda in to replace any of the components that you have in this application? That knowledge that you bring, I think, is going to be crucial to how you can do that. Alternatively, there are third-party tools that can do that. There are some best practices that the application developers can bring to the table. There are developers that can, again, when we talk about platform ops, this is where the ops team and the development team are able to communicate to identify some of the inefficiencies that you're talking about. So maybe moving from a traditional organization of your IT team, if your IT team is still very siloed, systems engineers, network engineers, development engineers, etc., moving to a platform ops team using DevOps principles will create the collaboration, hopefully, that you're looking for that allows you to identify these inefficiencies. Because these inefficiencies are going to come as a result of customer feedback. So you're hearing customer feedback on the user experience, on the slowness or sluggishness, on the performance of the application. It is your job to then talk to the development team on how you can address this. There's a little bit of SRE in here, I know. These terms are a little bit, confusing, but this is one of the ways that you can start to identify some of these inefficiencies.
Great. That was a very nice, comprehensive answer. And let's move on to the next one. Some of these you might have touched upon, but maybe you could just summarize or re-amplify what you said earlier. Next question is, can you identify just a couple common reasons for underutilized resources in an AWS environment and how organizations identify and address them?
Yeah. So underutilized resources can happen a couple different ways. Sometimes underutilized resources is we've spun up some virtual machines or some instances, and honestly, we've forgotten about that workload. That is something that I find very common is, this workload's been working fine. No one's really complained about it. Users are happy, developers are happy, management is happy. I'm just not going to touch it. And you forget about it. But if you end up with multiple workloads that are like that, sometimes you can find gems there because you can find these resources that are underutilized where you can change the underlying instances and you can save money and no one will pay attention. So that's one option. Um, Underutilized resources also can come from stubborn developers or stubborn application owners or stubborn um, how do we say this? The folks that sold you the application owners require exactly these resources. That is something that we saw a lot of during the virtualization days where uh, they would force you to have a certain number of CPUs or a certain number of memory. And I remember we used to fight over, well, I'm going to give you half and let's see how it performs. Now I say flip the script, give them what they require, but come back to this, monitor it, or look at trusted advisor recommendations, optimization, hub recommendations, and take a look at, hey, this, we've been running this for a year. It's only used 50%. Do you mind if we change it? I can't tell you how many times I've gone to application owners or developers and said, hey, it's 50% here that we can change. And the answer is it's okay, leave it. And it's okay, leave it for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's okay, leave it because when they open a support ticket with whoever sold us this application, whatever a vendor is, that vendor might complain that this thing is underutilized, although every metric that you have is showing you that, hey, this is underutilized. But the support case or the support engineer will have a problem with the fact that you have incorrectly configured this instance or virtual machine. So you have a lot of opportunity to identify those, again, either through tools, through regular assessment of a particular workload, your experience in it, but adjusting it is going to take, sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy. One of the things I'll tell you about your AWS environment is don't look at the whole environment, compartmentalize it. Look at workloads. They are smaller chunks that you can take a look at.
Sorry about that. I don't know where that came from. Please continue.
No, I was just saying, and I'm done. Just look at the environment compartmentalized, as it will be easier to digest rather than looking at the whole thing.
Okay, great. A quick reminder to the audience, please send in any questions you have because Elias lives and breathes this stuff. So this is a great opportunity for someone to get some expert one-on-one discourse. And let's go to the next question. How does AWS auto-scaling contribute to resource optimization in a cloud environment?
Well, auto-scaling contributes to resource optimization because instead of having more, so again, traditionally, what we did is, again, let's take the example of a web server farm that I've been talking about. When we went and purchased hardware, or when we went and provisioned virtual machines, we always provisioned or purchased for the peak. So we knew that at the peak, when all of our users are going to be using it, we are going to need 20 servers. So we went and bought 20 servers. Now, most of the time, these 20 servers were just sitting there idle because we didn't have all of our users at all times. We have designed for the peak. As a result, we spent more money that we don't need on a continuous basis. With auto scaling, you avoid having to do that because when you're kind of in a steady state and you don't need 20 servers, you need 5, you have the 5 servers. If you know that at the end of the month you need all 20 servers, then you can either schedule it to have 20 servers deployed in an auto scaling group at the end of the month. As a result, you've managed your peak, or you could put your policies in place that say, hey, as my usage starts to go up, I want you to automatically deploy new servers. So by doing that, you've optimized resources because you're using less than what you would need, and you're only using more when you need more.
Okay, here's a question that just popped up from Naidu in the audience, and he asked, what single optimization or tool gives you the most bang for your buck?
Oh, that's a tricky question. That's a tricky question. There isn't a single one. I would say in every service of AWS, there is a one thing that would make a difference, right? So I think auto scaling group would be one of them. I think storage lifecycle management in storage would be one of them. I think leveraging Lambda would be one of them. Using the right spot instances would be a really big bang for your buck. Using native services as opposed to third party gives you immediate bang for your buck in terms of immediate licensing costs, but also operational costs that are hidden. So there isn't a single one. Good try, but each service within AWS has at least one or two that you could leverage immediately.
Okay. Here's a detailed question from John in the audience. If you want to follow along in the Q&A console, Elias. John asked, when I need separate VMs for separate environments like staging or quality assurance, what would be your recommendation on running as different containers on maybe one of two EC2 instances, but as a ECS cluster so that all instances can be pooled and utilized?
Ooh, let me read that again. I like containers in general. So if your application allows for containers, some applications you have to run in VMs and it is what it is. But if you are able to leverage containers inside an ECS or an EKS cluster, I would say by all means, absolutely. There's no reason why you shouldn't do that. Containers are lighter, they're easier to use, easier to manage. Absolutely, I would say do that. Potentially use it in maybe a different AWS account, maybe a different VPC, just for isolation purposes, but I don't see why not.
Okay, great. Looks like we might have time for one or two more questions. Let's get right to them. What are some techniques for optimizing data storage costs in AWS, S3, and Glacier?
Policies. I would say policies are your best friend. Figuring out if the data is current, when you need to move the data between storage tiers. I think that would be critical, crucial. If you're not using policies to move data between the different tiers, I think that's a very big missed opportunity in terms of storage.
Okay, last question. Let's see what you do with this one. Are customers really implementing chargeback?
Oh, I would say very few. Actually implementing chargeback, I would say very few. And again, not because it's hard. And I think ERP systems are going to start to catch up to cloud and the fact that chargeback is important a lot. But if we look at where AWS started, when cloud started, the idea of chargeback was more of a business function, right? It's more when you're looking at the costing of things, the cost of goods sold, etc. It was more in that realm. It wasn't a very IT-ish thing, right? It only became, and I mean, we've talked about it during the virtualization days. It's something we always aspired for. But I think what happened with cloud is all of a sudden this idea of chargeback became a necessity. So I do think the ERP systems from the major providers are going to start to have easier implementation capabilities, easier features, easier modules to enable chargeback as opposed to what we have today. But again, that shouldn't be something that stops you from doing showbacks. Showbacks are just as effective. At the end of the day, whether the money moves or whether you're getting this money into your P&L, doesn't really matter to you, right? You want to show it, you want to justify it, you want to quantify it, but you don't really care how it happens, at least in my experience. I've seen CIOs, to be honest with you, I've talked to a couple of CIOs that have given up the budget completely and said, hey, I don't want a budget. The budget is all yours. You tell us what you want, and every application owner, every application team pays for these services that we're offering. That's a very intelligent approach, I believe, to IT today.
All right. right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Elias, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.